for want of a better word, Trumpization of politics over here. The likes of Farage and Tommy Robertson have seen the Trump playbook and have tried to adapt it to the United Kingdom. I think if things continue this way, despite Trump's core, I think he's going to take a very big beating at the midterms. And I, for one, will be cheering on whoever gives him a beating. There is a British tendency to make a joke out of everything, and Trump is obviously the butt of much humour over here, and so people like sort of laugh at Trump, but it's a fearful laugh. Well, if you would have told the founding fathers 250 years ago, they're going to celebrate with their stage professional on the White House lawn, I wonder, would they have scrapped the Constitution and just gone back to King George? And it's way below the dignity of the office of President of the United States. He's erratic, he's completely and utterly untrustworthy, he's a predator, I mean, in every area of life, and he will take advantage of any weakness. And so that leads ultimately to a fear. And I think the British people will be absolutely delighted, on the whole, when Trump's term in office ends.
Welcome to another edition of SOS America. I'm your host, Charles Feldman. Thanks for joining us if you're watching or you're listening. And you know then that for the past almost year now, we have been exploring together the question, what is actually happening at this point in time here in the U.S.? And we've asked that question to a wide variety of experts, journalists, physicians, attorneys, academics, you name it. But pretty much all of them have been here in the U.S. So for this particular episode, we thought it would be interesting to hear the view from somebody, not just anybody, of course, but someone who is knowledgeable, we think, from the other side of the Atlantic and how they view what is currently happening here in the States. So our guest for this episode is Tony Evans. He is a very experienced and very widely respected journalist in the UK. He has written for such publications as The Times, The Observer, The Sunday Times. He's often known as a sports journalist, but his expertise goes very far and wide beyond the world of sports, touching on everything from culture to media and, of course, to the world of politics. He's also an author, and we are pleased to have him as our guest on this episode. Tony, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Charles. And to put it into a little bit more context as well, I spent 7 years living in the United States, which is more than a tenth of my life. And I look upon what's happening now from across the Atlantic with absolute bewilderment.
Okay, so that's a good starting off point. And I presume when you lived here, and maybe that's the bad presumption, were you working here as a journalist at the time?
I got into journalism in the States. The first paper I worked for was the San Gabriel Valley Tribune. And then I worked for the Daily Bulletin in Ontario, California. So that's how I got into the business. And yeah, and I mean, that was back, I was living in California more than 30 years ago. But the atmosphere, the environment, and the outlook of Americans appear to be very different to the one I experienced, which was a really welcoming sort of feeling from them. And it's things have turned very much more insular, it seems, and aggressive. And that's happening everywhere. In Britain, we have our own problems with a similar sort of mentality. But it seems to have run wild in the United States under Trump.
So actually, that raises an interesting question when you talk about this happening worldwide. And I suspect you're talking not only about the UK, but you have a right-wing sort of tilt now in France, certainly in Germany, and a lot of other places. Is it a sort of, for lack of a better word, is it sort of a virus that's spreading, and is the focal point of that infection Donald Trump?
Oh, I think it goes wider than Trump. But yes, he is the focal point. I mean, I go back to Bill Clinton, and it's the economy, stupid. And we've seen certainly neoliberalism from the days of Thatcher and Reagan. We've seen the biggest transfer of wealth from the middle earners to the very, very high earners. And this is the internet age has pushed that along at a faster, increasingly faster pace. So we've seen that. Um, the credit crunch has a huge impact on Europe in 2008, and the rise of the right really uh, began seriously at that point. But the United States seems to have done well out of the in the post-credit crunch world, and yet still Trump come along and seems to be a lightning rod for every fear the American people have. And yet, unlike lightning rods, he won't protect them. In fact, he'll damage them. And is damaging them so badly, it's unbelievable. At least it seems from the perspective of sitting here in London, a mile from the Houses of Parliament.
Well, from your perspective in London, when you see or read about various things that the Trump administration is doing, do you how do you look at that? I mean, is it a sense of are you shocked? Are you, maybe it's past the point of being shocked anymore? But what is your general feeling when you pick up the paper in the morning or turn on the TV or radio and you hear the latest thing that is coming out of the White House?
I'm aghast. There is a British tendency to make a joke out of everything, and Trump is obviously the butt of much humour over here. I mean, I'm not saying there is a direct comparison here, but Hitler, one of the things that saved the British in the Second World War, apart from the United States, that is, was their sense of humour and the ability to see a dictator in a humorous fashion. Charlie Chaplin, obviously, is
Yeah.
a great example of that. And so people like sort of laugh at Trump, but it's a fearful laugh because you don't know what he's going to do. He's completely and utterly untrustworthy. And the punchline might turn out not to be a line, but an actual punch. And Britain might be on the receiving end, as other countries have. And he's erratic. He's completely and utterly untrustworthy. He's a predator. I mean, in every area of life, and he will take advantage of any weakness, and so that leads ultimately to a fear. And I think the British people will be absolutely delighted, on the whole, when Trump's term in office ends.
But when it ends, and presuming it will, I hope it will. Although, as you
Mm,
know, he's got this sort of fantasy, or at least some of his
mm.
supporters have a fantasy that he's going to run unconstitutionally for a third term. I don't think that's going to happen. But when he leaves, there's still the problem of the 70, what was it, 70, 77 million plus Americans who voted for him. Some have become disenchanted, I suspect, because of the way the economy is now. But still, he's got a sizable number of Americans who still are very supportive of him and his ideas. Does that frighten you that momentum may be unstoppable regardless of whether or not Donald Trump is in the White House?
Yeah, to a certain extent, but I think what we're seeing as well, and not just in the United States but across the world, is a restructuring of the political landscape, and Trump is part of that. I suspect that many of the people around him, like Vance, are actually pragmatists who are acting in a way working towards Trump's goals, but would probably perform differently if he wasn't around. I mean, they're more concerned with power, and I think there will be, as particularly as people become aware of how much of a failure this Iranian adventure was. I think there will become more disillusionment, and we'll see people beginning, and I think we actually have begun to see it. People begin to distance themselves slightly from Trump, and I think that that will happen. But yeah, whenever people, politicians play to prejudice and try to inflame hatred, it's a dangerous situation. And the residue of the Trump era will last, oh, probably a couple of decades. I just hope it doesn't outlive me.
Hopefully not. When the United States does something, when the president does something, tariffs, certainly the war in Iran, with Iran, it clearly has an impact on countries all over the world because of just the size of the U.S. and the weight that we pull on the world's economy. How has the Trump administration directly impacted, for example, we'll personalize it. Has it impacted your life as somebody living in the UK? And if so, how?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, prices have gone up massively. The rate of inflation is ridiculous. Food prices, certainly petrol, gas, as Americans would say, has gone up, and also British policy has changed. British state policy is changing, and because of what's going on in the United States. I mean, the old cliche is when America sneezes, Britain catches a cold. Certainly, I think that that is true, and I've long, although I'm very, very affectionate towards the United States and its people. As I say, I haven't lived there, but I've long been suspicious of this idea of a special relationship.
Hmm.
It's only special when it goes in Washington's favor. Um, so that is a little bit of a concern. But yeah, and there's also been a, for want of a better word, Trumpization of politics over here. The likes of Farage and Tommy Robertson have seen the Trump playbook and have tried to adapt it to the United Kingdom. I think ultimately it will fail, but there is a great sense. Trump is a shadow over Britain, and you can feel its effects. You can feel the effects of this shadow in terms of your pocketbook because, as I say, prices have gone up in a manner which they didn't go up in the first Trump term or before. And but it's also a metaphysical threat, which is a really big concern to the whole politics of what we once considered the Western Bloc, but now we can't look at it that way anymore.
And yet it's interesting because I do some political analysis for LBC Radio
Yeah.
there in the UK, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Ah, I've heard you on it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Very
And
good. Very good.
thank you. I appreciate it. But, while I'm on hold often, I get to hear some of the people who are calling in because it's a talk, as you know, it's a talk format. And sometimes I'm surprised at people who call in who seem very supportive of Donald Trump. And I've heard that to my astonished ears. And sometimes they're arguing with whomever the host happens to be at that particular hour. And they seem to they say, oh, we think he's doing a great job or he's doing this. And I have to admit that when I'm on hold listening to that, I sometimes want to kind of reach through the phone and grab these people and say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
How is this man in any way, shape, or form helping your life? How do you account for that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. I think, as someone who's also worked on a lot of shows where the people have been phoning in, you tend to get the same people over and over again, and they're highly
Mm.
motivated. I don't want to use the word crank, but I'll use the word crank. The cranks. But on the other point, yeah, reaching through the phone, the tech bros who have done so much damage to our political system, they haven't invented the one thing that I really want. It'd be a cyber punch or a telephone punch where you could reach down the line or through the screen, grab people and shake them. But yes, there is a small core of people in Britain who see Trump and his methods as the way forward. But I have to say, I think a lot of that is underpinned by racism, and they're extremely attracted by the undercurrents of white supremacy in the Trump regime.
You mentioned before this notion of a special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. And I agree with you. It does tend to be a relationship that's somewhat one-sided from the U.S. point of view. But that being said, there is this relationship that the U.S. has with NATO and yes, with the U.K. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, how fractured is that relationship now, in particular now with NATO? And is that repairable uh, after the Trump years, or is it going to take decades, if ever, to
Mm.
sort of put those pieces back together again?
I think there'll be a high level of suspicion, Charles, but I think the in Britain and across Europe, we realise that the world needs America as an engaged partner in in the politics wider than just the continental United States and well, obviously Hawaii and Alaska, but the world needs America, and I think. Uh, One thing, and I see it a lot of it online. I should stay offline. And people, Europeans hate Americans. We don't. We actually think that it's a great country. It's defined. It defined the culture of the 20th century and played a huge part in defeating fascism, a massive part. And the people of Europe will forever be grateful for it. But at a time of renewed danger, when Russia are clearly a threat, when China is, I mean, I don't think people think enough about what China are doing and how they are running their economy and the potential threat they pose on a wider level to the West. At a time like this, the United States not only seems to, I mean, we know that in the past there's been, sort of insularity and, isolation from the United States, back, between the two world wars, the idea that America first and that, yeah, that's unacceptable. But this goes beyond that. It's not America first, it's Trump first. He's not doing it for the greater good of the United States. He's doing it for the greater good of himself. And if you do get a president who it becomes clear that he is engaged politically for the benefit of his people, I think trust will come back very, very quickly because Britain, France, Germany want to trust America to a large extent, not completely, of course, but because no country can ever completely trust another, but they want to be partners with the United States. And Trump has burnt a lot of bridges, but I think they will rebuild relatively quickly. Whether the economy will recover at pace is a different question.
But can that trust at this point ever really be reconstituted? Isn't it kind of like a marriage, and when one partner is caught cheating, even if that party says, okay, it's never going to happen again, there's always going to be a little bit of that suspicion, right? Um, and after the first Trump term, and Joe Biden comes in, a lot of the world took sort of a sigh of relief, I think. And
Mm,
they said, oh, the US is back to normal, because Joe Biden was pro, NATO. Yes, he was pro the special relationship or whatever you want to call it between the US and the UK. He was everything that Trump is not.
mm.
Then, 4 years later, we are not just back where we were. One could argue we're worse than we were during the first Trump term. So, how can the world ever really feel secure again, if they ever did, in the reliability of the United States as a true ally?
I'd like to think, and I think a lot of people in Britain and in Europe think this, is that Trump's a one-off. you won't find a character like him who will reach the White House, who is so venal and such an appalling human being. Um, and we don't think. I think many of us think it was an accident of history in the sense of a lot of different events occurred which pushed them to the forefront, and also, we have, I mean, the influence of Russia in the elections and the influences of people like Elon Musk. Hopefully, the world will learn from that and begin to put in some checks and balances to stop that sort of manipulation of the public. One would hope. I know there are lots of people working on those ideas at the moment. But yeah, I mean, in terms of a marriage, the analogy is perfect, Charles, except divorce Trump, and that's a start. Trust will start to rebuild as soon as he's
Yeah,
out the door.
but who gets his children though?
No, no. Well, hopefully federal prison.
Let me make a sort of slight detour here because part of, as we mentioned, a large part of your career has also been sports journalism. So I'm curious what your thoughts are of at the time we are recording this episode. Just the other day, in honor apparently of Mr. Trump's 80th birthday, although he claims it was partly to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Independence from from the U.K., from England. He had this rather interesting, I guess it's a sports spectacle, on the lawn of the White House with a sort of ultra fighting competition. What, as somebody who's done a lot of sports journalism, what's your take on that?
Well, if you would have told the founding fathers 250 years ago, they're going to celebrate with stage professional wrestling on the White House lawn. I wonder, would they have scrapped the Constitution and just gone back to King George? It's insane. It's a vanity project, and it's way below the dignity of the office of President of the United States. And I mean, it's mind-boggling. The World Cup that's taken place, obviously in North America, Mexico, Canada, as well as the US, is Trump is in Trump's departments interfering heavily in that. The treatment of some of the teams from Africa, the Iranian team, is appalling. Could never have happened at any other World Cup, and FIFA bent over backwards. And this has been a common theme in my career where sports and politics cross over. That's one of my areas of expertise. So, we've seen people are talking about it in Europe as this being the Trump World Cup, and that's made it one of the great celebrations of global togetherness. Has been marred. The football will prevail and survive, but when people will look back at this World Cup, they'll look back on it like 1934, the Mussolini World Cup in Italy, the 1978 in Argentina. The World Cup of the Generals. It's in a year where we've seen ICE shooting American citizens on the streets, and you look at it and you go, that is not reasonable. And you have other people who are freeze framing the incidents to try and prove that the police officers were actually justified. You think this is an insane world, and certainly it's in America that is excusing perpetrators, and one of the biggest perpetrators is in the White House, and for 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 political purposes, for purposes of dogma, and it really, it's something that, I mean, in my lifetime, there's been some bad presidents. I mean, what one president was, in a very senior position in the CIA. That's got to be a pretty bad, Richard Nixon, but
Oh yeah.
no one has been anywhere near as bad as Trump, and no one has negatively has an impact on the dignity of the United States, like Trump. And I think that's one of the hardest things. You look at the tourism figures, the people who are not going from Europe because of Trump. You look at the World Cup. There are great crowds and the atmosphere is fantastic, but still the hotels lost a lot of money because people decided not to go because of fear of Trump, because of fear of ICE, and it was so far from give me your poor and huddled masses. And I think everyone, for my lifetime, everyone in Europe, sort of, not everyone, obviously, but most of us looked up to the United States. Now we're not looking up. We're disturbed. We're depressed.
You mentioned in the beginning of the episode that you lived here in the States for I think you said 7 years.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you live in the US now?
No, no, not at all. Not at all. I think for me, and this obviously is not directly Trump, but one of the big tipping points was Sandy Hook. The moment when you realise that I understand that the rich people, the politicians, don't care about shootings in the ghetto, and they can put that out of their minds. But when you see a bunch of you know little white little kids being shot with automatic weapons, and not only that, the right wing try to deny it happened and and claim that the bereaved families, were actors. That was where politically it jumped the shark for me. And I thought, I always said to my daughter, who's in her mid 20s now, you should go and live in the United States. It's just a brilliant place to live. I was 20 when I went to New York for the first time in 1980, and people said New York was the most violent place in the world. People were
Mm.
terrified of New York, and it was just wonderful. It was so warm, welcoming. It's once you get past that crust of that New Yorker terseness, sort of.
Yeah.
I found it, and I had no fear. I lived in Southern California, say for 6 years. Around the San Fernando Valley, out into up towards Ontario, around that area, down in Orange County, and I very rarely felt unsafe. I felt, but now it feels a country with rage at its heart. And Trump is the very manifestation of rage. He's had everything he ever wanted, and it's not enough. And that's one of the things that gets me about him and the people around him. They're all so angry. They've achieved everything they wanted. Most of them were born to huge wealth. You'd think they'd be a little bit happy, but they're not. They're furious, and they want revenge on people who've done nothing to them. And they,
But what do you think is feeding that anger? Where does that anger come from? Because I agree with you that these are people who, for the most part, are fairly privileged people. They come from very, wealthy or at least upper middle class
mm,
uh, backgrounds. They've had good educations. One can argue whether the outcome of those
yeah.
educations had the requisite results, but they did nonetheless have, pretty good backgrounds. What do you think they're angry about?
It's hard to see. I mean, certainly there is a strong element of the they believe in America that and an America that really didn't exist. They'd like it to be white. They'd like it to be, sort of, I often hear people, certainly on that, with those political views, talk about the 50s and the 60s and how different it was. You could walk the streets safely, and basically the undercurrent of that is the blacks kept to their side of the tracks. But you know
Mm.
what? When you actually look into the crime figures and the golden age of these people, actually things are much better now. The murder rates have dropped off a cliff since the mid 70s, and and
Yeah.
and I think they pine for a world where which they imagine rather than never existed. And one thing that did strike me, Charles, when I lived in the United States, and particularly white women, was their real sort of visible and visceral fear of black men. And I think they obviously better intellects than me, and there've been huge studies on the impact of slavery and how it still remains. And I think there's an element of that, and also the common fear we see in you see everywhere people speaking Spanish, speak English. You're in America. We're getting to see some of that over here now, and it's like one of the things that the demographics of the United States have always shifted. We know it was a country of immigrants, Irish, Italians, Jews, and they come in, and it's always shifted. And I suppose you got a little bit of that. But there seems to be certainly among white people, this terrible fear that, the Hispanic cultures are going to take over. And I think that drives a lot of the rage. Also, I think too many of them have lived in gated communities away from real people for too long because of the wealth, and they don't have a sense of what reality is.
It's funny you mentioned when you were in New York. I grew up in New York City, and I used to find it really funny when I was, by the time I was old enough to kind of wander around the streets of Manhattan on my own, and I would sometimes see these tour buses unloading passengers from whether it was other parts of the U.S. or maybe from overseas. And I would often hear the tour guide instructing them, make sure you stay together because, it's dangerous walking around New York. And I would think, that's ridiculous. I'm walking around all the time by myself. I don't
Mm.
feel particularly in danger of anything. And these people were being instructed, make sure you don't separate because who knows what's going to happen to you if you do. And I just thought it was ludicrous, funny, but also somewhat sad because I think those people ended up walking away from their particular trip with this notion that America was really unsafe when it really isn't and
No,
wasn't.
no, no. It's yeah. I spent a lot of time in the after hours bars down in Alphabet City.
Yeah.
It's like, and people say, no, don't go to Alphabet City, and I'm like, no, it was absolutely fine. There were people
Yeah,
who
that's fine.
lots of people who were expressing themselves in a different way to suburban Britain or America, but no one was a problem, and I think. One of the great things I've found about the United States is that people were, certainly in my experience, and I say it's more than 3 decades ago, 4 decades in New York, people were happy for you to express yourself, be different. No one ever, sort of complains about my accents. They always love my accents. They sometimes ask me what language I was speaking, and it's seriously, but like they were actually engaged and interested and wanted to sort of wanted to be more aware of it, and find out more about me. I suspect that sort of part of the American psyche is not as strong because of the growing fear mongering. And of course, as someone who's worked in the media for a long time, you do realize how easy it is to influence people and to plant ideas which are not only wrong but insidious and dangerous. And as we've moved into the internet age, we've had people who are more and more skilled at doing this, and the fear of the other, the outsider, is massive, across the world. That this is not just in the United States, but we see its biggest expression, and in the biggest nation in terms of when I say biggest in terms of stature in the
Yeah.
Western world, and the nation that's had the most cultural influence in the past century and a half.
Let me get to, because we didn't really go much into it, but I want to. The current conflict war, really, between the United States and Iran. When the Strait of Hormuz was closed by the Iranians, President Trump started to rail against the UK, against NATO countries. He wanted to know why they weren't helping to open the strait, and he pointed fingers saying, we don't need their help now. We needed it when this all began, even though he, of course, was responsible for causing the problems to begin with. Um, do you think the UK and the other NATO allies were now, in retrospect, correct in keeping somewhat of a distance from this particular war between the U.S., which the U.S. and Israel together did, of course, against Iran? Were those countries, was your country correct in kind of being a little bit standoffish about it? Or was the president correct that everybody should have chipped in together?
Well, I think the first thing on that, Charles, is if you're going to have a fight and you want your mates to help you, give them a call before it and warn them. And the fact that the British and the European allies weren't told in advance, I think that was a bit of a shock. But secondly, it's I think the overwhelming public support in the UK was to stay out of it. I was talking to someone from the Ministry of Defence, and they said they've war gamed that situation in the Gulf many times, and basically you can't win. And it's the victory would be Pyrrhic at best. And and then when you see Trump come on, I mean, because he said last year with the famous bunker buster bomb, we've eradicated any
Yeah.
Iranian hopes of building a nuclear weapon, and then all of a sudden it starts again. They can build a nuclear weapon. They're a threat to us all, and because we've all been here before with Iraq, and we saw the hell that was unleashed on not just the Middle East but the world. I mean, part of the refugee crisis, that the ongoing refugee crisis, was caused by that. So, and its knock-on effects. So, people were very, very cautious about it. But then Trump declares victory repeatedly. So, they've got no army, they've got no navy, they can't attack us. They're being bombed back into the Stone Age. And then the next thing you see, Iran are hitting back. People don't believe a word Trump is saying, and his base obviously do, because they will forget the lie immediately and then move on to the next one. But yeah, I think this was something, had the president spoken to his allies across Europe before going in, they all would have said, be careful here.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, now we have, again, at the time of this recording, we have this sort of alleged agreement, although it's not clear what it is that the U.S. and Iran have agreed to. It seems from initial reports to be kind of an agreement to agree to, at some point in the next 60 days, begin to talk about what they might do. I mean, it seems to be a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, as opposed to any concrete agreement. Um, so it seems, at least from my point of view, and I'm curious what your point of view is on this, Tony. It seems like not only are we no better off than we were before the war with Iran, but we're worse off, no matter what they agreed to, unless they agree to let the U.S. come in 30 days and remove all of the enriched uranium. And I doubt the Iranians are going to agree to that. And unless they agree to go beyond what the accord was that was reached with the Obama White House, which was, I think it was a 15-year stipulation that they wouldn't do anything in terms of nuclear enrichment, unless it really far exceeds that, which I really doubt it's going to. From my point of view, it seems like we're worse off because the Iranians have now learned, if they didn't know it before, that they have more power than they may have thought they had. They don't need
Mm.
missiles. They don't need drones. They don't need anything except to close the strait or to threaten to close the strait. And that makes insurance companies say, wait a minute, we're not going to insure this.
Mm.
And then the ships just won't go through. That's an enormous amount of power.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean the reports certainly in the UK are that the President Trump has agreed to pay 300 billion to the Iranians, which is, I mean, and of course he'll declare victory, but it's a mess. And the worst thing is, you know what? I don't think there's any of us who think that the regime in Iran was a good thing.
Yeah.
It was good government. The Iranian people were edging towards regime change. It might have taken, another couple of years. But, I was speaking to an expat, said there was a momentum that was heading to the inevitable point, which is the overthrow of the mullahs, and and then this war started, and it unified the the whole country because there's an external attacker, and suddenly the regime is more cemented than ever. So there's damage done on so many points. You look at, I mean, the Saudis and the Qataris, Kuwait. I mean, they are very, very obviously unhappy with what the United States has done. The only real winner of this, and in the short term, and it won't be a long term thing, is Netanyahu and Israel. But again, that you just think he is leading Israel down a blind alley to, and I fear what will happen in the Middle East and what will happen to Israel. It's and this is completely unnecessary. None of this was necessary. The Iranians weren't a threat, a legitimate threat at this point, and probably with a relaxation of sanctions and a bit of diplomacy, the West could have achieved its aims without this this abject mess in the Gulf.
One thought that occurred to me is that, I was thinking back, I remember seeing a recent documentary. I can't remember which one it was now, but it was showing a clip of when then President Dwight Eisenhower was leaving office, and he warned about the military industrial complex. And you know, it makes me think that the real beneficiaries of what just happened in Iran are the military contractors, because Europe, for example, the UK, now what do they want to do? They want to buy more weapons so that they can be more self-protective and not have to rely on the US. But where does that money go? To a large degree, it goes to American
Yeah.
military contractors, because they make a lot of the
Mm.
planes and the ammunition, all that stuff. And so I kind of wonder if this isn't sort of real world proof that Eisenhower all those years ago, back in the early '60s, was right.
Well, yeah, and I mean, he's a man who knew about war. It's
Yeah.
no one knew better than him. So yeah, it is a concern. And again, the very richest people in the world are involved in the arms trade and the manufacture of munitions. So again, we see, and I mean, what you see over here, is the first place that politicians say when they say we need to get more funding for the military. They say cut welfare. They don't say let's have a look at the taxation system and and see
Yeah.
if there is a more equitable way of doing this. And perhaps have a look at some of the loopholes that the billionaires with their accountants can can use to pay less tax. It's like, let's cut welfare. And obviously, that leads to more social instability. It leads to more people who lack uh, education, who lack basic support, who live in a state of fear. And that's perfect for right wing politicians like Trump. You prey on the fears. Oh, it's the immigrants, they're coming to take more away from you. And so we enter this cycle of fear all the time. And that's, I think that in a lot of ways has been part of the reason for the Trump phenomena, living, in this cycle of fear. And it seems to me, Charles, that it's it when I lived in the United States, there didn't seem to be as many people who were struggling to pay for health insurance. It didn't seem to be the numbers who were going bankrupt because they got ill. It didn't seem to me that, and again, this is part of the trend. People who we keep hearing about in the States, you're three paychecks away from being homeless, and that causes the sort of fear that the worst, most venal type of politicians feed on.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking of, especially because of what's been happening in with Iran, but also with Ukraine and Russia, that a lot of the money that U.S. tax dollars go to, because unlike rather where you are in the U.K., our tax dollars for the most part, they don't go toward medical care, for example,
Mm,
except for Medicare, which is for 65 and older. Um, but a lot of our tax dollars go to, the military. The military
mm,
gets trillions of dollars every year, not billions, but trillions of
mm,
dollars every single year to produce what they produce. And yet, when you look at what's been happening in Ukraine and Russia, and now with Iran, so much of the fighting is being done by relatively inexpensive drones that cost, maybe a couple of thousand, if that, per drone, as opposed to, the billions that go into developing a sophisticated jet, fighter plane. So one wonders why there isn't a dramatic shift now, and the realization that if you're going to have a war, you need to protect yourself or be offensive in some cases. Um, why can't you do it so much cheaper and then divert that money that was going to build these very expensive war machines into more social good? And that's just a thought I had. I don't.
yeah, yeah. Well, I thought I'd spoken too long, so I didn't want to say that in answering your
No,
last
no.
question. But I was in a discussion with someone from GCHQ, which is the intelligence agency in the UK, and they were saying to me, this was some months ago. They were saying to me, what Ukraine has proved is that a conventional war doesn't exist anymore. So, it's not really worth building tanks. It's not where, you can do it cheaper. He said the two places that we should be investing in is drones, obviously, but also cyber protection against
Yeah.
against particularly Russian intrusions into our computer systems and the way they can destabilize society. He said the whole nature of it's changed, and the politicians don't seem to have caught up with that yet. They want to do the same thing, build missiles, fire missiles, which he said is not the future of warfare. And yeah, if that would be absolutely, I mean, it's a mark a sea change in the way that economies are run. If you could divert the money that we're currently putting into weaponry and missiles into social care and then change. I've got to say, I look at some politicians and think they don't want to change the nature of this social contract because they enjoy breathing fear, and that will keep them in power.
Well, that's right. And I do think it's because these, economic interests, if I'm, I don't want to single any particular contractor out, but why not? If I'm Northrop, or if I'm
Mm,
Boeing, or any one of the large companies that manufacture, very expensive war equipment, um, I don't want it to end. I want that money to come pouring in. And I have the lobbying power in Washington to make sure that that keeps happening, even though the evidence is now showing you can wage a very effective either offensive war or defensive war using a drone, which is, again, I mean, you know, uh, it's relatively inexpensive to produce, and it doesn't require a lot of training. To train a jet fighter pilot is a very expensive, time-consuming operation. To train somebody to sit in a room and operate a drone, especially if you can add artificial intelligence to it, is not very time-consuming or expensive.
yeah, yeah, and the Russians are finding that out in a big way in Ukraine, and so I think we should all governments should be looking at that as a template for going forward, rather um, than being at the beck and call of these huge companies, sort of Lockheed, Boeing, and basically, yeah, it's amazing the amount of government grants these companies get as well, and
Yeah.
it's they're taking at both ends, and no one seems to want to consider a different way.
So I'm going to ask you, as we end this episode, to be somewhat clairvoyant. Your prognosis, optimistic, pessimistic, for say, I don't want to go too far into the future. It's hard enough to predict nowadays what's going to happen in 24 hours. But let's take a 5-year outlook. What's your take on the next 5 years?
Well, the next 5 years, I'm hoping it will be. We'll see the end of Trump as a political figure, and we will see a rebuilding of the relationships with the United States and its allies. And I would hope that we will see a a, a more sensible economic policy from the governments across the Atlantic that that begins to address some of the real concerns that people should have. Because at this stage, you do think the worlds we live in with the gig economy, the fact that people don't have any certainty in their lives, the potential for that to cause instability, social and political, is terrifying. In my worst case scenario, is Trump reignites the war in Iran sometime in October, says he can't hold the midterms because the United States is at war, and it creates a huge political crisis, and that would be very, very bad. I think if things continue this way, despite Trump's core, I think he's going to take a very big beating at the midterms, and I, for one, will be cheering on whoever gives him a beating.
Tony Evans, it was a pleasure talking with you and having you as a guest. Thank you very much. And for those of you who have been following us for these episodes on SOS America, as always, we welcome your comments. If you would like to subscribe, it is absolutely free, so by all means do so. Until the next episode of SOS America, I'm Charles Feldman. Thank you very much.